She called me 2 weeks before my wedding and asked, in the sweetest voice she could manage, whether she could wear white. And I said yes. What she didn't know, what she never bothered to find out, was that I wasn't wearing white. And by the time she figured that out, she was already standing in the middle of 200 people in a floor-length bridal gown, looking like she'd wandered into the wrong ceremony. This is the story of how my mother-in-law tried to steal the spotlight at my wedding, and how I let her walk straight into her own humiliation without lifting a single finger. I need to take you back a little, because this story doesn't start with a phone call. It starts with a woman who decided, from the moment her son told her he was marrying me, that I was not what she had in mind. My name is Priya. I grew up in a Tamil family, deeply rooted in our culture and traditions. When Arjun and I got engaged, I was overjoyed. He was kind, thoughtful, and he loved me in the quiet, steady way that makes you feel safe. His mother, Diane, was a different story entirely. Diane had imagined a very specific future for her son. I don't know exactly what that future looked like, but I know it didn't look like me. From our first meeting, she was polite in the way that sharp things are sometimes wrapped in soft cloth. You don't notice the edge until you're already bleeding. She commented on my cooking when I hadn't cooked anything. She asked Arjun, in front of me, whether he was sure he was ready for such a big cultural adjustment. She once referred to my family's wedding traditions as a lot. Not in a curious way. In the way people say something is too much when they mean it's too foreign. He wasn't blind to his mother's behavior, and to his credit, he addressed it more than once. But Diane had a talent for reframing. Every pointed comment became a misunderstanding. Every slight became sensitivity on my part. And because Arjun loved his mother, and I loved Arjun, I held my tongue more times than I should have. I told myself it would get better. I told myself she just needed time. I was wrong on both counts. The wedding planning started, and so did the campaign. Diane had opinions about everything. The venue, too far from her friends. The food, too spicy. Could we offer something more? Accessible. The guest list. Did we really need to invite all of my cousins? Each suggestion was framed as helpfulness. Each one was a quiet attempt to sand down the parts of me she found inconvenient. I listened, I nodded, and then I went home and planned the wedding I had always dreamed of, because it was my wedding and I had been dreaming of it my entire life. The centerpiece of that dream was my lehenga. If you're not familiar, a lehenga is a traditional South Asian bridal outfit. A long embroidered skirt, a fitted blouse, and a flowing dupatta, which is a kind of veil or scarf draped over the shoulder or head. Mine was a deep, rich red, the color of celebration and love in my culture, hand-embroidered with gold thread in patterns that my mother and I had spent months choosing together. It was breathtaking, and it was absolutely, unmistakably not white. Diane did not know this. And here's where I have to be honest with you. That was not an accident. She had never asked. In all the months of planning, in all the conversations about flowers and food and seating charts, Diane never once asked what I would be wearing. She assumed, because she had already decided what kind of wedding this was going to be, what kind of bride I was going to be, and what kind of daughter-in-law I was going to be. And I let her assume because I had learned something important about Diane by then. She didn't listen. She performed listening, but she was really just waiting for the world to arrange itself the way she expected. So when she called 2 weeks before the ceremony and asked in that sugary voice whether she could wear white, I understood immediately what she was doing. She wanted to show up in bridal white and let everyone draw their own conclusions. She wanted to be looked at. She wanted to matter in a room that was supposed to be mine. And I smiled into the phone, and I said, "Of course, Diane. Wear whatever makes you feel beautiful." I did not tell Arjun about the call right away. I sat with it for a day, turning it over in my mind, asking myself if I should say something, if I should warn her, if I should give her the information she was too proud to ask for. And then I thought about every comment she had made about my culture. Every, "Are you sure?" and maybe something simpler, and a lot. And I thought about my lehenga hanging in my childhood bedroom, and my mother's hands tracing the gold embroidery, and I thought, no, I will not rob her of this lesson she is about to teach herself. I told Arjun that evening. I told him his mother had called, that she'd asked to wear white, and that I had said yes. He went very still. He asked me if I was sure. I told him I was completely sure. He looked at me for a long moment, and then something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but something close to relief. He said, "Okay," and that was enough. The wedding day arrived with the kind of clarity that only comes after months of noise. My mother dressed me in the lehenga herself, just as her mother had dressed her, and her mother before that. The gold thread caught the light and turned it into something warm and ancient. My hands were painted with henna that had dried overnight, and my hair was pinned with flowers. When I looked in the mirror, I did not see a woman trying to be anything. I saw a woman arriving, fully, as herself. The ceremony was held in a banquet hall that we had transformed with marigolds and silk draping and the smell of jasmine. The guests arrived in waves. My family in bright salwar kameez and silk saris, Arjun's family and friends in suits and cocktail dresses, everyone mixing and laughing and taking photographs in front of the floral mandap. It was everything I had imagined. It was loud and warm and overflowing with love. And then Diane arrived. I didn't see her walk in. I heard about it afterward, in pieces, from different people who all had the same expression on their face when they told me, a kind of stunned, second-hand embarrassment mixed with helpless amusement. Diane had arrived in a floor-length white gown. Not an ivory guest dress, not an off-white sundress, with what someone described to me as a situation on the back, which I can only interpret as some kind of train or dramatic draping. She had her hair done. She was wearing more jewelry than I had ever seen her wear. She had dressed for a wedding where she was the main event. The problem, of course, was that the main event was already in the room, and she was wearing red. I've been told the moment she walked in and scanned the space and finally found me across the room, her face went through several stages in rapid succession. Confusion first, then a kind of recalibration, then something that people described differently depending on who was telling the story. Some said embarrassment, some said fury. One of my aunties said she looked like a woman who had just realized she was holding the wrong ticket on the wrong train. Whatever it was, she recovered quickly, or tried to. She straightened her spine and smiled and greeted people, and she spent the entire evening in that white gown, being not quite what she had planned to be. Because here is what Diane had not understood, what she had never bothered to understand. At an Indian wedding, the bride in red is not competing with a woman in white. The woman in white is simply invisible next to her. Not because of any rule or social decree, but because the red lehenga, the gold embroidery, the flowers, the henna, the mandap, all of it is designed to draw every eye in the room to one person. The visual language of the celebration speaks clearly and loudly, and it says, there she is. That is the bride. Diane's white gown, which might have caused a scene at a Western ceremony, was simply beside the point. It was a non sequitur. It was a punchline without a setup. Guests noticed, of course. My family, who understood exactly what a white bridal gown meant and exactly what it was intended to do, noticed with a particularly sharp clarity. There were whispered conversations I was not part of and did not need to be. There were looks exchanged over plates of biryani. There were a few people who came to me quietly and said things like, "Your mother-in-law is very bold, and I see she dressed up in the tone of voice that means the opposite of what it sounds like." I smiled and said she always liked to look her best, and I moved on, because I had a wedding to be present for. Arjun found his mother at some point during the reception. I don't know exactly what passed between them. What I know is that he came back to me afterward with a jaw that was tight in a way I recognized, and he took my hand and held it very firmly and said, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry she did this." And I told him he had nothing to apologize for. Because he didn't. He hadn't worn the dress. He hadn't made the call. He had simply been born to a woman who thought the world owed her the center of every room, and that wasn't something he had chosen. What happened in the weeks and months after the wedding was quieter than the wedding itself, but in some ways more significant. Diane's behavior that day did not go unnoticed by the people who mattered. Arjun's aunts and cousins, who had always been politely neutral on the subject of his mother, were no longer neutral. Family members who had given her the benefit of the doubt stopped doing so. The story traveled, as wedding stories always do, and it traveled with a kind of momentum that Diane could not control, because she had provided all the evidence herself. She had worn the dress. She had walked into the room. She had done it in front of 200 witnesses. Arjun began to set limits with his mother that he had been reluctant to set before. Not in a dramatic, explosive way, that was never his style, but in the steady, quiet way of someone who has finally seen something clearly and cannot unsee it. Phone calls became less frequent. Visits became scheduled rather than spontaneous. Diane's opinions about our home, our choices, our future, stopped being entertained in the way they had been before. He didn't cut her off, but he stopped letting her love come with conditions attached to me. Diane, for her part, tried several approaches in the aftermath. There was the apology that wasn't really an apology. "I'm sorry you felt uncomfortable with my outfit choice," which is the verbal equivalent of a white gown at a red lehenga wedding. There was the attempt to reframe the whole thing as a cultural misunderstanding, as if she hadn't spent months being informed about my culture and choosing not to absorb any of it. There was a period of wounded silence, during which I think she expected us to come to her and smooth things over. We did not. We were busy building a life, and we built it without her drama as a foundation. I want to be honest about something, because I think honesty is the only thing that makes a story like this worth telling. I am not a person who enjoys watching someone humiliate themselves. I didn't stand across that banquet hall and feel triumphant when I saw Diane's expression change. What I felt was something quieter and more complicated, a kind of sad recognition that she had been given every opportunity to show up differently, and she had chosen this. She had chosen a white dress over a relationship with her son's wife. She had chosen a performance over a presence, and she had done it so completely, so publicly, that there was no way to pretend it hadn't happened. The malicious compliance people talk about online, I understand why they celebrate it. There is something deeply satisfying about a situation where someone's own scheme becomes their undoing. But I want to be clear, I didn't scheme. I didn't plan a trap. I simply stopped protecting Diane from the consequences of her own choices. I stopped filling in the gaps she left with her assumptions. I stopped offering information she hadn't asked for and didn't deserve. I let her walk into the room she had built for herself, and I stood in mine. My lehenga is hanging in a garment bag in our bedroom now. Sometimes I take it out and look at it. The gold thread still catches the light the same way. My mother calls it a good luck piece, something to pass on someday. I think she's right. It carried me through the most important day of my life, looking exactly like what I was. A woman who knew who she was, where she came from, and what she deserved. No white dress was ever going to change that. No amount of strategic outfit planning was ever going to dim something that had been woven into fabric over months, and into me over a lifetime. Arjun and I have been married for over a year now. Our home is warm and full of the things we love. His books stacked on every surface, my mother's recipes taped inside the cabinet doors, photographs of both our families on the walls, because that is what a real blending looks like. It is not one person erasing another. It is two people choosing each other fully, and building something that has room for all of it. Diane comes to dinner occasionally. She is careful now in a way she wasn't before. She asks questions instead of making pronouncements. She compliments the food. It is not warmth, not yet, maybe not ever, but it is a kind of respect, and I will take respect. I sometimes think about what would have happened if I had warned her. If I had said, Diane, I should mention, I'll be wearing a traditional red lehenga, so you may want to reconsider. Would she have backed down? Would she have chosen differently? Maybe, but I think she also would have found another way, another angle, another small, sharp thing wrapped in soft cloth. Because the dress was never really about the dress. It was about a woman who could not accept that her son had chosen someone she hadn't chosen for him, and who was willing to make that everyone's problem. The dress was just the form that took on that particular day. What I know is this: I could not have planned a better outcome if I had tried. Not because I am clever, though I like to think I am, and not because Diane is foolish, though she was that day, but because the truth has a way of arranging itself, eventually, into something visible. All I had to do was stop standing in front of it. I always was going to wear red, and when I walked into that room, every single person in it knew exactly who the bride was. That was never in question. It was never going to be in question. The only person who hadn't figured that out was the woman in the white gown, and by the time she did, the lesson had already been learned, just not by me. If you're watching this and you have a Diane in your life, someone who underestimates you, who assumes you'll shrink, who mistakes your silence for weakness, I want you to hear this. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply show up as yourself, completely and without apology. Let them make their assumptions. Let them dress for a performance you were never going to give. And then walk into the room in your red lehenga, with your gold thread and your mother's hands in your memory and your whole self intact, and let the truth do what it was always going to do. It doesn't need your help. It just needs you to get out of the way.